We'll move to the discussion part of the meeting, and I'm going to ask Tim to kick that off by offering us some comments on the book.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much to Vim and Amelia. And
can you just speak and make sure you've got
sorry.
the microphone? Just angle it a bit.
Well, thanks very much to Vim and Amelia and to Caroline for hosting this. You, I think, were meant to get our chief economist, Alan Winters, today, but I'm afraid he had another commitment, so you got me instead. So, but we'll try and give some sort of responses to this and some reaction in terms of what DFID's interested in. I mean, I think this is a very useful book and comes at a very good time. Attention to vulnerability, has been around for as long as development studies has been around, but it comes and it goes. And I think at the moment, obviously, it's a time when lots of people are thinking about vulnerability again, given the impact of the crises over the last 2 years. It tends to focus our minds on some of the downside risks of a model of economic growth and hopefully poverty-reducing growth that focus perhaps excessively on raising average incomes and raising average household livelihood without looking at the rather large risks of falling back and the high degree of interconnectedness that was involved in that. At a slightly more philosophical level, I think talking about vulnerability is interesting as well because it relates in some ways to this debate that's bubbling along about beyond GDP, beyond income measures of well-being. And again, this isn't a new debate, it comes and it goes, but I think it's an interesting place at the moment with the Sarkozy Commission and Amartya Sen and Stiglitz discussing the imperfections of simple average measures of well-being. I mean, I think it relates to that not only because it shows that average is subject to being reversed in the face of risks, but also because living with vulnerability is itself a component of psychological well-being. If you are not currently poor, but you're living with the awareness that you are highly exposed to risks that you are not going to be very well able to cope with, that in itself is a component of not living as people would like to. I think the book is very interesting in trying and very, very helpful in trying to relate household level and national vulnerability. I mean, I think that's something that a lot of us are still struggling with. What are the relationships between this? I think particularly for the case of small island economies, which a lot of the time, in focusing on these enormous numbers that are in circulation, especially in the context of the crisis, we sometimes overlook particular small nations with particular vulnerabilities. I think it's also interesting in bringing together two slightly different threads of sort of traditions of analysis, which would be that of natural hazards and that of more macroeconomic analysis. Looking at the analysis of countries in transition together with those subject to vulnerability to floods or earthquakes and such like, and also to then introduce the concept of vulnerability to policy or political risk. I think that the chapter on Zimbabwe is a very interesting one of that. So a few comments briefly about measurement. I mean, I think measurement of vulnerability is very important. If we're aiming to reduce poverty in the future, then we do need to look at not only those who are poor now, but those who are vulnerable to falling into poverty in the future. And to do that, we have to have some sensible measure of that vulnerability. I think there is a real difficulty. I think it's hard sometimes just to explain how we measure poverty. Trying to explain vulnerability is a further order of difficulty, and I think it is quite difficult to explain the very sophisticated econometric measures of vulnerability to policymakers, to populations, to politicians in a way that sort of accords with their intuitive sense. The other thing I'd say is I think some of these measures are we just have to remember some of these measures of vulnerability are very data and very skill hungry. I mean, for example, the analysis of the ICRISAT data set in Chapter 2, the Indian data set, is fascinating, but that is a data set, that ran from the mid-70s to the mid-80s. So I think there is a danger, and it depends which measure of vulnerability you're using, but there is a danger sometimes that we're refining our rear view mirror and we're still trying to sort of peer out through a very murky windscreen. Almost by definition, developing countries are countries that are undergoing quite rapid economic and social change. So what we can learn about vulnerability, 5 years ago or 10 years ago might have to be interpreted with caution in interpreting what the current level of vulnerability and the current nature of vulnerability of different groups are. I think the book contains excellent examples of both quantitative and qualitative analysis of vulnerability. And I think the chapter by ODI's Kate Bird and Martin Krause is a good example of the qualitative approach, looking at the life histories. And as I say, the chapter 2 on the ICRISAT data is very, very good on the statistical measures. I think one of the things that one of the rewarding areas of policy now is looking at how you can combine qualitative and quantitative purposively. So how can you use life histories to identify, by the very prosaic way of saying what affected your life, how can you then feed that back into your analysis of survey data sets? So I think that is one area for future study, to make your analysis more rounded, more triangulated. I'm mixing my metaphors there. I'm not sure if you can be more round and more triangular at the same time, but you get the idea. In terms of policy implications, Simon Maxwell from ODI was very fond of saying, what do we do differently on Monday morning? So what do we do differently if we pay more attention to vulnerability as well as current poverty? And the book highlights that policies to tackle vulnerability can be somewhat different from policies to tackle current poverty. So, to be crude, if you're looking to reduce the percentage of people under a poverty line, one way is to help those currently poor out of poverty. The other is to try and give people those safety nets, those buttresses, to make sure that the currently okay don't dip below the poverty line in the future. And those are going to be slightly different sets of policies. So I think there's going to be some basic choices between what the authors called strengthening resilience and building bulk walks, which map, I think, fairly nicely onto other terms that people have used, such as promotional and protection. So a choice between building up people's capacity to handle shocks, building up their asset bases, their levels of average income, their health, their nutrition, their literacy and skills, between putting things there to help them when a shock hits. I think policymakers also face some tough choices on whether they should focus efforts on protecting households against idiosyncratic risk, the risks that hit households one by one, which, as Wim said, turn out to be a major part of total vulnerability. I think there's choices between trying to help households tackle that and trying to put in place defences against covariant risks, those occasional but very large shocks that can move many people into poverty very quickly. And those are really tough choices. And again, it comes back to how do we analyse vulnerability and the fact that our measures of vulnerability are generally backward-looking. A measurement of vulnerability based on the last 5 years up to 2007 wouldn't have told you much about who was going to be vulnerable following the food, fuel and financial crises. There's no way around this, but it's just something to bear in mind. Some of the questions I think are floating around at the moment would be, is globalization increasing the level of vulnerability, or is it just changing the nature of sources of vulnerability and who is vulnerable? Smallholder farmers trying to get by in rain-fed environments with very little inputs and very poor access to markets have always been incredibly vulnerable. And this is something that we can sometimes overlook when we think about vulnerability to huge sweeping macroeconomic shocks. So we're talking about different types of vulnerability, that's clear, but are we talking about a different aggregate level of vulnerability? Are we talking, this is a very optimistic spin, I'm not convinced, but this is an optimistic spin. Are we talking, is perhaps the level of vulnerability not much changed? The variance, the volatility is increased, perhaps, but given that globalization is raising average incomes, maybe people's capacity to cope with it offsets that level of volatility? So these are some of the questions that I think we're trying to get a feel for. Yeah, I mean, I think there's also taking it down to a household level. I think part of the problem is that even if the level of vulnerability was roughly the same, and I think that's arguable, people's understanding of how to deal with it is different. I mean, farmers are broadly used to the risk of harvest failure. They're broadly used to the risks of pests or illness. Recent migrants to a city to work in a garment factory have no idea of the kind of global forces that might put them out of work in the next year. So maybe it's about the imperfect predictability of events that you know are going to happen sometime, but you don't know when and you don't know how badly. I think there's also interesting questions about the extent to which categories of vulnerable groups and fragile states overlap and the extent to which they can be separated. I mean, clearly, state fragility is a source of vulnerability for households, but I think you can also have very strong states that aren't going anywhere anytime soon, which create vulnerability for many households. I mean, I think it's it's a good question about whether North Korea is a fragile state. It seems remarkably robust as a state. Broadly, what are DFID's interests in these sort of areas? We're interested in a better capacity to monitor levels of poverty and vulnerability. We're very keen supporters of the Global Impact and Vulnerability Alert System that the UN is developing. And the idea there is to provide us with slightly more real-time information on global levels of poverty and vulnerability when a global shock strikes. So we're not always trying to process data that's 3 years old. We're trying to pull together different source streams of data into a picture that's a bit more useful for policymakers. I think there's been excellent work going on both in ODI. There was recent ODI UNICEF work on the impact of the crisis on children. There's a crisis watch initiative, I think, which a number of NGOs and think tanks are starting to get involved in. And the ILO and the World Bank, I think, in a very promising manner, are working together very closely on monitoring the employment effects of the crisis. I think a major part of work and the bit that sort of the team I belong to is working on is looking at expanding support to social protection systems. There's a commitment in the last white paper that DFID will help sort of build support that will get social protection to 50 million people in 20 countries over the next 3 years. So we're trying to work out exactly how to do that and how we might measure it. I think the last decade has seen some incredible innovations in social protection, mainly but not only in middle-income countries. So we're now trying to think about how those can be translated to low-income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. But that one set of authors has described that as a quiet revolution over the last 10 years that sort of happened really without anybody in the donors particularly noticing or driving it, really driven more by countries themselves. So we're interested in picking up and sort of supporting that. Thinking on fragile states and how best to help them, this has been an increasing focus of DFID strategy in the last 2 white papers. And it's reflecting the kind of analysis that I think you see in Paul Collier's The Bottom Billion, that increasingly there are many poor in countries that are growing, but they will eventually, most of them will be helped out of poverty by things that those countries are doing. Increasingly, the concentration of the world's poor in some countries that have really systematic, multivariate problems, and that should be the focus for international development assistance. I think the thinking now is on how to ensure a balance and synergy between state building and peace building. We recognise that a strong state is a strong, effective state is a precursor to recovery from conflict or avoiding conflict, but we recognise it's not enough on its own. And finally, I think there's ongoing debates about the relationship between growth and development, or growth and poverty reduction. Are we saying that we just want growth, that growth that should be the focus, just get growth going, or are we saying that it should be inclusive, that it should be pro-poor, that it should aim to reduce volatility, so people get knocked back less often? and there was a nice phrase that was floating around over the last year or two about building back better. You know, coming out of the other side of the crisis, how do we actually put in place economic systems and systems for effective states that maybe harness the growth of the boom years that we have seen, but without all of those drawbacks. So thank you very much for an extremely stimulating and broad contribution to the literature, and we look forward to staying engaged. Thanks.